Evening. This is the May edition of Operation City on Your Hill. I'm your host, Robert Maynard. And tonight's show is going to be called the Trump-Russia Investigation in the Mafia State. Basically, there's been a lot of talk about the Mueller report and what it found and what it did found. A lot of the people we're talking about haven't actually read it. But the report, there's two issues that they're referring to. One is whether or not justice was obstructed, there was an obstruction of justice, and then the nature of the context and relationship between the Trump organization and the Russian government. So I want to, we'll leave this, for now I'll leave the topic alone about the obstruction of justice part. I want to look into the nature of the relationships between the Trump organization and the Russian state, because I think this is long-term going forward. This is the kind of thing that is a national security issue that we need to take a look at. And so I think that we are not taking this part of it seriously enough, and the investigation I don't think was adequate because of the magnitude of what was in play here. So if you read through the Mueller report, instead of reading what people are saying about it, you actually read the Mueller report. They're finding, okay, you got activities by the Russian government to try to sway the election. And I won't go into all the different activities, but there was significant activities, and there was a lot of social media stuff going on. And then you got activities on the part of the campaign that was to cooperate with these kind of activities, but it was through intermediaries. So you got very active cooperation, in-depth cooperation by many figures in the Trump campaign with elements of the Russian people. And you got activities on behalf of the Russian government to influence the campaign. So you have motivation and activities on both sides, and it lays that out. What is not clear on is the connection. The final, you got all these dots connected. The final dot connected is how cognizant were the Trump people that the people they were connected to were in turn connected with the Russian government. That last dot connected it wasn't that they didn't have evidence that there was a connection there, as the evidence didn't rise to a indictable offense. In other words, for legal purposes, if you're going to charge someone with something like that, it's got to be more than just evidence. You've got to have evidence that constitutes proof beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt. And so that it wasn't clear, because some people say because there was a lot of covering up going on, so they weren't able to interview Trump. But that's another issue. I think but anyway, the point being made is that they weren't able to establish beyond a reasonable shadow of doubt whether or not these connections that the Trump campaign officials made with these Russian actors, whether or not they were aware that the Russian actors themselves were working in the interests of the Putin government. Now that was the last connection, and I think it's a very murky connection to make, because they're investigating the Russian government in the apparatus of the Russian government the same way you would a traditional nation state. And personally I think that was the mistake. And I want to go into, there's also, I want to go into a couple of things. The apparatus and the reason why it's so murky. And I want to go into what was driving, beyond, what was driving them. What was the end game? What was Putin's end game, so to speak? So, which personally I think was the scope to understand this is much bigger than what the scope. The Mueller investigation was coming under certain restrictions, and they had a certain scope. You can't look into this. You can't look into this. You can't look into this. You got so we might find this stuff out yet, because a lot of stuff was handed off to the Southern District in New York Federal Court. There's ongoing investigations where, oh, here, you can't look at this, here, hand this off to someone else. So to be determined whether or not this stuff is going to come to light. So what I want to take a look at is the activity, the history of what happened to the state of Russia in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had, as you all remember, the Berlin Wall in Eastern Europe. You had this kind of, you had to follow the Berlin Wall, and you had the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. And that was followed up soon by the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. And as you may or may not remember, Putin himself was a longtime KGB agent, so he's present when this all is happening. During the time when Gorbachev he's making overtures towards the West, many believe in an attempt to stave off the imminent collapse of what he saw is coming. So he's making overtures towards the West, and he's making, trying to create this peace movement where we're going to have this relationship. And Gorbachev had proposed that the West come together with the Soviet Union to create this new order. And this new order would be something that the U.S. and the Soviet Union would be partners in making, like they did after World War II. You had Russia was a partner in the creation of the United Nations. And so Gorbachev is proposing something similar. This is Cold War is coming to an end. Let's have this new order, and we want a partnership between the U.S. and Soviet Union. And the U.S. and allies rejected it, and they rejected it, and they kept NATO. And so it made it look like there's still elements of the Cold War going on, and Russia is embarrassed on the international stage. And we can argue whether or not Gorbachev's proposal should have been rejected. I'm not so, I don't think he was offering anything that, possibly diffusing NATO at that time might have been useful, but I don't imagine the Gorbachev proposal was anything freedom lovers would have liked to. I don't know the details of it. But this rejection was an embarrassment for them. And then all of a sudden now you have Yeltsin. Eventually you have Soviet Union is collapsing. And you have Yeltsin, and the forces of democracy take over, and you have this, you see Yeltsin climbing up on a tank and yelling democracy. And it was a very heady time for the people who believed in democracy. And they wanted democracy to triumph. And at that time, there was a lot of reform efforts. I think, in retrospect, looking back on that, there should have been cultural reform going along with it, in terms of, because you try a bunch of economic reform, privatizing industry, which is a good thing, but before you privatize industry, you have to make sure that the hands it's going to be privatized into is not corrupt. And so you might want to have a cultural cleanup operation going on, and that's what in retrospect, looking back, this is probably what was missing. So you have a privatization going on, and these state-owned industries are being privatized and are ended up in private hands. And a lot of these people are shady characters, to say the least. And so you have these mafia-like figures that are corrupt figures of Russian. You have the rise of the Russian oligarchs, who are sucking up these state-owned industries, and they're getting very rich. So they become a power block. And then you had the other power was after the fall of communism as an ideology, you had the rise of the Russian Orthodox Church as a bastion of traditionalism. Now, it wasn't freedom in the sense that you see in the American religious tradition. You have a separation of church and state. So church supposedly is on the side of civil society and not necessarily controlled by the state. So the ideology of separation of church and state was supposed to limit the role of the state, and so that religion played a role, according to the founders and Jefferson, religion played a role for moral strength that a free people needed for self-government. And so whether or not you believe the theology of the church or not, Jefferson wasn't an Orthodox Christian, but he recognized the role that he needed to play, that religion played in keeping a moral foundation for a free society. In Russia, you had the union of church and state. And the state was kind of like the enforcer for the church, and the church was, it was kind of like in Tsarist Russia. And that was the vision that the Orthodox leaders, Russian Orthodox leaders, were envisioning. And that was probably the Russian oligarchs who were taking over these state-owned industries and in this privatization move. Oh, we're fine with that as long as we control all the money. So there's a lot of corruption and there's a lot of alcoholism going on. And Yeltsin himself was caught in the middle of all this. I mean, trying to reform this, and was beyond him. And he wasn't able to do it. And he unfortunately took to drinking, and Putin was able to take over eventually. And so Putin comes to power, and he sees two power bases within Russia. You have the Russian Orthodox Church, and you have these oligarchs. And so the oligarchs are kind of like a Russian mafia. And Russia, on the surface, you had these, you kept having these elections, and you had a state apparatus, but you had a parallel apparatus in the creation of what is referred to as a Mafia State. And so you have the financial power of these oligarchs. Now, Putin ostensibly is going through this anti-corruption campaign where he's trying to weed out all this corruption. To a certain extent, he did. But what he's actually trying to do is weed out those people who aren't coming under his dominion. So it became so in the name of weeding out corruption, he's basically putting all these oligarchs under his thumb. And they don't control the entire state apparatus because they're not interested in everything. They're interested in what's going to make them money. And so, to a certain extent, the state apparatus is separate from them. To a certain extent, they're controlling it. It's not that clear cut. And so the same is true with the Russian Orthodox Church, who has become a bastion of support for traditionalism. So Putin, although supposedly democratically elected, you still have a trappings of democracy. It becomes like a new Russian czar. And they, instead of a revitalization of communism, see, the difference between traditionalism, I'm going to start getting into the ideological dimension rather than where the power base is. We're going to go into ideological. The traditionalists believed, and we talked about this in the last section, is that what you're preserving is a blood and soil, people in place. Whether it's Jeffersonian individualism, Jeffersonian liberalism, or whether it's the communist version of the state controlling everything, that ideology, political ideology, is based upon universalized principles that hold people together. And we hold, and in the case with Jeffersonian American tradition, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And in the case of Marxist or socialist ideology, it's class struggle. And you're held together, regardless of nation state or blood or soil or any of this other stuff, by belonging to a class. You know, you're either the workers' class, or you're in the proletariat, or you're part of the bourgeoisie. And so that was the conflict between Jeffersonian democracy and this form, democratic socialism or communism, is not so much ideology versus tradition, but it's more or less the role that the state has to play. In Jeffersonian democracy, the state plays a limited role in civil society, voluntary associations, and family church and things like that, and moral values play the more important role. And so you have, the state is the institution based upon the use of force, so you limit the role of the state. But they both agree that there are certain universal principles that hold us together. Whereas the traditionalist in the sense of Putin is arguing that you have these loyalty to people in place, and so what you're loyal to is not an ideological construct, whether it be the class struggle or whether we hold these truths to be self-evident. You got these people from this place. You got, you know, so that's the traditionalist order. So the regime in Soviet Union went from a communist regime to a traditionalist regime. Communist regime ostensibly was based upon the class struggle. It's totalitarian. It's limited government, and as opposed to Jeffersonian traditional democracy, yes, because they want the state to rule. But the regime that it went to rejects ideological constructs, and so it became, it's just like in World War II. The Nazis and the fascists ideologically were at odds with the communists. They were totalitarian regimes, both sides, but one of them wanted to base their order on blood and soil, on tradition, on place and people, and one wanted to base their order on an international proletariat. So they were both authoritarian regimes, and they were both threats to democracy. And originally they started out as allies to attack the American idea of freedom and democracy, and they ended up at each other's throats. So we're assuming, people are assuming, because they might be against one another, then they're for us. In other words, the Soviet Union was opposed to the Nazis, so therefore they're our friends. But that really wasn't the case, and now you have these conservatives who are they're opposing the centralization of political power in these international organizations, not so much because they oppose the centralization of political power, but because they oppose this idea of promoting global democracy. And they want to see a traditionalist order. American conservatives oppose the centralization of political power in global entities because they oppose centralization of political power. If they're traditional, we hold these truths to be self-evident, Americans. So the forces of Russian nationalism were able to make allies within the conservative movement. I won't go into that a lot because that's a whole different story. At a time that they're making these allies, Trump is making business overtures to economic interests in the former Soviet Union. And actually, even before the Soviet Union collapsed, there was economic connections going on. During the 90s, he went bankrupt 6 times, and he couldn't get any loans. So all of a sudden, he started getting money again. He after being bankrupt 6 times, he couldn't get any loans from the traditional Western banks. So he started getting, a lot of them come from, he says, I don't have any business in Russia, but a lot of the Russians had business in his entities. And the argument that being made here that needs to be investigated is to what extent would a review of his finances show that he's been propped up all these years by Russian oligarchs, and that he's putting his name on these real estate ventures, but they're putting money into it. And to what extent is he bought and paid for by them? In other words, he owes his soul to them. And these connections are being made, through decades. They're deep connections, and they're not directly connections with the Russian state, because, like I said, the apparatus is a little bit murky. There are connections with Russian oligarchs, but these Russian oligarchs don't breathe without permission from the Russian state, because Putin had went through his purge, his corruption, anti-corruption campaign. He got rid of all the corrupt people, meaning got rid of all the people who weren't willing to play ball with him. So now you got this Mafia State under the control of Putin. Connecting the dots without seeing the big picture is pretty near impossible. And so that's what we got now. We got actors who are ostensibly an arm of the Russian state, but legally not necessarily. It's hard to make the connect the dots unless you look at the overall history and the history of who was in and who was out in terms of these purges. And okay, there's not a direct legal connection between this person and the Putin regime, but anybody with half a brain knows that these people operate on behalf of the enrichment of Putin and his clan. You got his immediate family, but you got the clan of oligarchs. And so there's even if you read, one of the things that we should have been doing is, there's a lot of Russian intellectuals that rose up in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they want to revive the kind of fascist experiment that fell apart during World War II, only fix it, make it better, make fascism great again, Mafia. So they seen the mistake that the Germans and the Italians and them made, and there was, I can't remember the guy's name, there was this one particular guy in particular who was writing about creating this new traditionalist order that would be opposed to this international global democratic order. So he's writing about this. And during the Soviet Union, you had this state entity, there was a media entity, it was called Pravda. And that was the propaganda arm for the Soviet state. During the time, later on, you had something called Pravda.ru, which is like Pravda Times. RU is like the Times. You know, you have New York Times, you have the LA Times, it's kind of, I think it means truth, actually. No, Pravda means truth. I can't remember. Truth Times. Maybe it's Pravda means truth. I can't remember exactly. But that was not a communist. It wasn't the old communist thing. It was a Russian nationalist site. And I found it on the website one time, and I was looking through it all, and it's really clear that they don't like the former communist regime because they blame them for running the glory of this glorious Russian experiment in power. They ran it into the ground. And of course they ran it into the ground because it's not based upon something substantial. It's based upon an ideological construct. And so they want to root their move to return the glory of Russia, the Russian Empire, in blood and soil, and the people in a place. And so and they're looking for allies, and they're looking to undermine U.S. democracy. Now, in some senses, you look at when you're looking at the actions of the Russian government, I mean not the Russian government, the government under Trump, you say, look, well, he's not doing a lot of stuff that is in the interest of the Russian state. No, but he is doing certain stuff that is in the interest of some of the oligarchs that he's got ties to. They're making good money. And he's also giving a lot of propaganda value to Putin. Putin's standing on the world stage is elevated under Trump. Trump treats the guy as if he was, like he treats Putin as if Putin has got more wisdom than his own intelligence apparatus. Well, Putin told me this, so therefore it must be true. And that's elevating Putin's status on the world stage, which is helping him tremendously. So this is, because some of the policies are not pro-Russian state, then they're saying, well, there's nothing going on. And now, to what extent Trump is cognizant of what he's doing, or to what extent he's being played, is anybody's question. But it is not in our interest for this to be ignored to the extent that it is. And even though people who are pushing, oh, we need to impeach Trump, which maybe we do. But what we really need is to get a better understanding of what's at stake and what's been going on. And I don't think, ironically enough, one of the few figures who has a better inkling of what's going on was the Christopher Steele and this so-called Steele dossier. Now, he had actually got paid originally by conservative forces to do away with Trump during the Republican primary. But then he eventually got paid by the Democrats. I don't care who he paid for. There's a fallacy of logical argument against a person. Because he was paid by certain people, then his information is no good. That's not necessarily true. His stands or falls on his own merit. And of all the intelligence sources I have read, and I've read a lot of them, Christopher Steele is the only one who identifies this Russian traditionalist world order as a goal that is motivating and animating Russian activity. So I think we should take a little bit more seriously the Steele dossier and take a look at it. Now, there are certain things in it that I find questionable. There's some salacious stuff about the prostitutes, and you can read that with a grain of sand. But whether or not he was paid for by political opponents of Trump is irrelevant to the quality of work he did. The guy obviously knows what he understands Russian and what's going on over there, probably better than any of our own intelligence officers. So it is high time that we get a better understanding of what's going on and stop playing political football between what the Republicans are trying to exonerate Trump and the Democrats are trying to impeach Trump. And they're both playing political football, and neither one of them, what we really need is to get to the bottom of what's really going on. And doesn't look like that's happening. Hopefully that will happen in some of these other investigations, like the Southern District in New York and various other entities that are going on now that it's not getting much play. And it would be nice if some of the redacted stuff of the Mueller report came out to Congress, because Congress has, I think, a responsibility beyond the political fighting back and forth to deal with national security. There are national security caucuses that so some of this stuff needs to be looked into, because it is a security threat. One of the biggest goals they have is to get rid of this traditional democratic order, and the traditional democratic order is being led by the U.S., so the U.S. is a major target of what they're up to. So that has been Operation City on a Hill for this month. I probably am gonna go into a little bit more detail next month on the efforts on the part of the former Soviets and some of these Russian nationalists and the different figures, including the Orthodox Church, to make their alliances with conservative forces, and how this affected the conservative movement. So we'll see you next month, and we may go into that then. Have a nice night, and we'll see you later.